class, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about gender and age, mostly just gender for now. And if you just could take a moment and look at this picture, there should be something that you should notice about these two babies in the picture. If you haven't noticed, they're exactly the same baby. And so when we talk about things like gender and sex, we often assume biology is a critical component in our issues with gender and sex. But today we're going to talk a little bit more about the sociological or cultural aspects that influence our understanding of what we think is biological in terms of gender and sex. So first of all, we need to know some of the definitions. The definition of sex deals with the biological definition, so your primary sexual organs. However, gender is actually it's actually the cultural expectations that are assigned to either the male gender or the female gender. So in contrast to sex, where it's referring to the biological distinctions, gender considers the societal expectations. So your gender or your gendered behavior can either fit into the expectations of your biological sex, or it can diverge from the expectations of the biological sex. Gender inequality simply refers to the inequality that we see based on the attributes of different genders. So when we talk about the pay gap, we're talking about gender inequality. And when we talk about educational issues or how we perceive a leader to act, we're often talking about gender inequality issues. Patriarchy is the male dominance of a culture, history, society. Historically, we have seen what appears to be patriarchal dominance throughout the world, but we have found examples of matriarchal dominances within different cultures and societies. But history tends to ignore those cultures or those societies, and also when we come into contact with them as a patriarchal society, we tend to ignore or not see or force that change onto that society. And then we'll talk about minority and dominant groups. So we've talked about this in the past. So minority groups are those that are the subordinate group, and dominant groups are those that are the dominant group within the culture or the society at that time. So when we talk about sex and gender, the dominant group would be males, and the subordinate or minority group would be the females. So often when we talk about sex and gender, we assume that there is a connection. And when we look at a person, we think we always know what their sex is going to be. In reality, we're using what we call secondary sexual characteristics. And as you can see here, this picture may seem unusual to you. And that's because it's something that you probably have assumed does not occur in our society or naturally, biologically. This actually occurs fairly often. So there are, in essence, biologically 5 sexes. You have a variation or a spectrum in between the male and the female sexual organs, just like you have a spectrum in between male and female gendered behavior. And it is so what we today would call a person intersexed. You might have heard the term transsexual or transgender in the past. Today we use the term intersexed. And intersexed refers to anybody who falls within that middle spectrum. They're not on either end of that biological spectrum, meaning not completely male or not completely female in those biological terms, meaning internal, external characteristics, also meaning chromosomes and secondary and primary sexual organs. So we often assume that this is actually pretty rare, but in reality, this happens fairly commonly in our society. You see somebody in your daily life who is intersexed about as often as you see somebody who is redheaded in your daily life. So you come across people who are intersexed on a fairly regular basis. We're talking approximately between 1% and 2% of the population. We don't realize that we see people who are intersexed that often, mostly because there has been throughout history, our current history, a really big push to change people's biological gender to fit these binaries that we assume to be true within our society. And today, this push from the medical community to force people into one end or the other of the spectrum has received quite the backlash and outcry from the intersex community, because it's a type of forced assumption about what is within that normal spectrum, and it amounts to something similar to what what people are calling mutilation of the sexual organs. So when we talk about gender in terms of these type of attributes that we assume are natural for one sex or the other. In reality, a lot of the gendered behavior that we assume to be biological is actually learned. And so I kind of show you a picture here where, this young gentleman seems to believe that just wearing pink and wearing a dress is what makes women appear to be women. And as you can tell, he is doing male gendered behavior that he's not even noticing he's doing. So a lot of times, even think about how you're sitting as you're listening to this video. Are you sitting with your legs open, with your arms open? In society, we allow men to have more space when they sit at a table, more space when they ride a bus, more space when they go through their daily lives. We expect women and push women to use less space, to speak in a more quiet voice, to make themselves smaller. So it's this expectation that women are smaller and therefore should use up less physical space, and it changes the body postures and the gendered behavior. So doing gender is very much a part of how we perceive one sex or the other to actually be, when in reality it's something that we learn and we teach. We teach children about colors, what's the appropriate gendered colors every single day. We also teach them about the appropriate gendered behavior. We're more likely to correct a little girl and ask her to say please and thank you than we are to correct a little boy and ask him to say please and thank you. We are more likely as a society to take an infant boy and toss him up in the air, while we would take an infant girl and cuddle her and speak more softly to her. So what we want to start with is we want to actually talk about feminism and the different waves of feminism. So a lot of times as students, we don't think about feminism as several different forms or waves of feminism. The first wave of feminism is what you would often think of as the right to vote. And it actually had two different components. One was a less conservative component, which this would have been the extreme radical feminism. And these women were pushing for a reform in all the institutions of society, meaning within education, within the home, within the workplace, and all these, and within political systems. And they wanted to have equality for women within all these different spectrums. And they were considered to be a very radical branch of feminism. The second and more conservative branch was concerned with winning the vote for women, the right for women to vote. They eventually did win the right for women to vote. And after that, the more radical wave of feminism kind of subsided and died out. It wasn't till the 1960s that we saw the second wave of feminism. The second wave of feminism was really a push from middle-class white women who wanted to move into the workforce, and they often thought of work as temporary activities that were intended to fill time between when they were completing their high school or college diploma and when they got married. After marriage, women often left the workplace, and in the 1960s, women were looking to move into the workplace. But this was really a middle-class white women's movement or feminist movement. Women who were minorities, Hispanic women, Black women, they were already in the workplace. They were already working full-time jobs to support their families and to maintain the household. And so this was a wave of feminism that really excluded their interests and their rights, which brings us to the third wave of feminism. This is the more recent wave of feminism, and it is largely today still within the realm of academia, which is where a lot of these different political and academic assertions start, is within academia. So the first part of this was really a focus on the problems of women in the least industrialized nations. Some of them are fighting against conditions to overcome, these long, hard, unequal treatment between men and women. A second part of this is the criticism on the male-dominated values within the work and society. So a lot of what we think of as competition, toughness, independence represent, according to this wave of feminism, these male-dominated values. And there's a push towards creating more connection and interdependence and cooperation within the workplace, or what we would call more gender-neutral values. Another aspect of this is the focus on women's right to sexual pleasure. So the third wave of feminism, as you can tell, has a lot of different components or interests, and it's really trying to push that, as well as these different interests, that women from different racial and socioeconomic backgrounds are going to have different interests or needs in terms of that particular wave of feminism. So next I want to talk about violence against women. We're going to talk first about suttee. And suttee is the practice of burning wives on husbands' funeral piles. So in India, for example, where you have this practice has gone, and in Persian cultures where you have this practice that has gone on for centuries, women were often considered to be, or women who were left behind by a husband, are considered to be a drain on the society and a drain on the economics of the family. So the practice of burning the wife with the husband when he dies represents a way to deal with the additional kind of economic drain or emotional strain that wife would leave or represent in terms of the strain she's putting on the family or on the society. The problem that has occurred is in these same cultures, you also see a practice of much older men marrying much younger wives. So these men who are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s are marrying young girls that are 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. So if a 50-year-old man marries a 15-year-old girl and 10 years later he passes away, his 25-year-old wife would be burned on the funeral pile. So honor killings, this is a representation of, or essentially the killing of a female member of the family because they disgrace the family in one way, shape, or form. So this would be a brother killing his sister because she had sex with someone else. And this includes, if she lost her virginity, this would also include rape. So if a young girl is raped, she would be then disgracing the family, and therefore she could be killed in order to reinstate the honor of the family. I want to talk about what we call female circumcision. So female circumcision is a practice that it's happened throughout the world. It still occurs today. It's occurred in everywhere from unindustrialized nations all the way through to very urban industrialized nations, and it is essentially the same as a female castration. So female circumcision, or what they call FGM, which is female genital mutilation, happens with, essentially what happens is that the young girl, or sometimes child, will have her clitoris cut off, the hood cut off, both of the lips cut almost off and sewn together. So when you cut off the clitoris of a female, you're essentially doing the same thing that you would be doing if you cut off the entire penis of a male. So what is being called circumcision is not the same thing as we understand male circumcision in our society today. The reason why it is practiced is for a variety of different cultural reasons, but mostly it's a way of keeping the chastity of young girls. So one of the stories that I give an example, often in modern society, in American culture, we are appalled by these types of practices. And a lot of times people want to, quote unquote, help. And so one of the stories that I'd like to discuss is an example of a group of applied, basically activists who had gone to a small community, and they were trying to prevent the female circumcision from occurring. So what they did was they removed the head woman who was doing most of the female circumcisions, to find that she was replaced almost immediately by several very young women who did the female circumcisions in her place. And what they found was that the older woman was actually not doing a full female circumcision. She was cutting just the hood and sewing the lips together, leaving the clitoris intact and leaving the lips almost completely intact. So she was fulfilling the obligations for the community, for the cultural and historical practice, but leaving the young girl's genitalia almost completely intact in such a way that it was causing a minimal amount of trauma. When she was replaced by the younger versions doing the same thing, they went ahead and cut off the entire hood, the entire clitoris, and almost the entire lips, causing much more severe trauma to the girls who were left behind to receive that type of female circumcision. So when I ask questions like, do members of other cultures have the right to interfere? With caution. You may see something as inappropriate or as violence against women, which it is, but that doesn't mean that with your limited understanding, it is always the most appropriate action to go ahead and intercede or with the practices of that community or culture. Sometimes we do this with a sense of assuming that we know better, and we don't always. So I also want to talk a little bit about gender inequality across the social structures. So first, let's talk about healthcare. And the book talks about the example of coronary bypass surgery, where they found statistically that women are 2 times more likely to die after coronary bypass surgery. And doctors and people were actually kind of shocked to find this out, because we always assume coronary bypass or heart problems is a male disease and a male issue. And when sociologists started to investigate this, they found that the reason why women were more likely to die from a heart attack and more likely to die after coronary bypass surgery had nothing to do with smaller arteries or more difficulties with female bodies or female hearts. It had to do with the fact that women are taken 1/10 as seriously when they complain of chest pains. So when women complain of health issues, they are taken less seriously, and therefore they are less likely to receive the intervention they need to save their lives. I had a recent example of this myself where I went in to deal with my own health issues with my doctor. I went in 3 different times to tell him about my health issues, and he didn't take me seriously. Knowing this and being a sociologist, I decided to take my husband in for a visit at the same time. And I had my husband tell the doctor what I had already told him 3 different times. And lo and behold, I was taken, or my husband was taken very seriously, and they corrected my medication in terms of dealing with my health issue. It wasn't that my husband said anything different or even used different language. It was simply that when it came out of my husband's mouth, even about my health issues, he was going to be taken more seriously. So then the book goes on to talk about education, and it talks about until 1832, women actually could not attend college with men. When we finally did allow women to attend college with men, women had to do the guys' laundry, do the cooking, serve men food, do this type of activity. So while going to college, they were also made into essential servants of their college male counterparts. Now, today people like to say that obviously we have gender equality because we have more women graduating from high school or from college than we do men. And this is true. We do have more women attending college, and we do have more women, getting college diplomas than we do men. However, it takes a woman a college diploma to earn on average what a man earns with a high school diploma. And when we look at different types of gender inequality in pay. So we've all heard the term, women make 75 cents on the dollar. And one of the supposed rationales for this is this wage gap is because women choose industries or choose professions that pay less money. So that type of data was looked at, and what we found was that when you look at women and men and compare women to men in the same industry, women are still making 75 cents, about 75% of what men make. So if you look here, it says mining. On average, men in mining make about 90,000, whereas women make about 70. In manufacturing, where men make about 50,000, women are making about 45. Construction, men make on average 53,000, where women are making 42. Government and defense, men make on average 62,000 a year, where women make about 56. So even when we're comparing the same industry, women are making on average 75 cents to the dollar that men. So men aren't necessarily choosing higher paying jobs, but men, even if men and women choose the same job, men will still get paid more. In addition to that, when women overwhelmingly choose a type of profession, psychology is a good example of this, and social work, when a field is predominated by men, the pay is on average higher and the prestige is much higher. When women move into a particular field and tend to dominate that field, the prestige of that field, the perception of the prestige of that field goes down and the pay goes down. One of the things that the reason why they believe that women don't make as much as men is because women hit what they call a glass ceiling. And that is where women can only move up to a certain point and then no longer can advance within their profession to a higher status or prestige job, and therefore a higher pay job. At the same time, they talk about what they call the glass escalator for men. So whereas women are hitting a glass ceiling, men have essentially an invisible escalator that's helping them move up to different types of high-paying jobs and high-prestige jobs. And even some of the CEOs that we say, you know, some of the highest-paying CEOs, which there are only a few that are women, one of the CEOs was actually a man for most of his career and only became a woman recently. And so he's now in that category of women, and says himself that one of the reasons why he's in the position he is in is because he navigated through the world as a man for much part of his actual career. Of course, you know, I like you guys to watch additional videos. So this one is actually on sexuality in music and media, and I'd like you to just kind of give it a look and, you know, address it in terms of what you learned about in the reading for this chapter. And then I want to talk to you about, you know, the combination between race status and sex status. So this is race as class status. And this is kind of a commentary done by the gentleman on the right in this discussion of how women, white women in particular, are used as a status symbol. And he's kind of, you know, making or showing kind of this parody of how women are used almost as a form of appendage or a symbol of status. She's being worn as a scarf here. And essentially in this other picture, we see how this is done in the media, in everyday life on a regular basis, and how women are being used as a form or a way for men to show their status or show their prestige. So often, there are a lot of types of stereotypes attached to being male or female. Yet, being male and female is together what, as a society, keeps us going. So what we don't think about often is the different types of similarities that we assume to be biological, and how that we are actually socialized into believing that our development, our gendered behavior is biological, when in reality we share most of that type of behavior. So the next slide is a gender stereotype of males and females. Now, this was a slide that was used by a grade school teacher, and she used it to talk about the differences between men and women. And as you can see, it's very much on this kind of biased biological spectrum, and these gendered stereotypes that are not necessarily appropriate because they don't really fit the reality of gendered behavior, right? And so instead of looking at things on a binary, I want to push you guys to look at gendered behavior and on a spectrum. So, you know, it said here, men, you think, you approach, she feels, she sits back and accepts. You base decisions on fact and experience. She bases decisions on emotion and expectations. You say you like or love her. She tests to see if you like or love her. You state your needs. She makes you figure out her needs. You have to lead. She gets to follow. You want sex. She withholds sex. You think sex is primarily physical. She thinks it's primarily emotional. You don't read minds. She thinks she does. So as you could see, these gendered stereotypes, albeit inappropriate, were used by a grade school teacher to point out what she thought was the norm or the obvious in these gendered expectations or ideas about how people behave, men and women. What I would like you to do is to create something to talk to children about sex and gendered behavior that doesn't put men and women on this binary, that shows a more progressive and less sexually biased representation of men and women's behaviors and emotions. So that's your assignment. Good luck. Have a great day.